Thank you all for being here today for our WiLSWorld shorts. Um, our session today is on all things data related. And so for those who I have not yet had the opportunity to meet, my name is Kim, and I work here at WiLS as a data analyst and consultant on our consulting team. My background is actually in the social sciences, sociology, and anthropology. And this really gave me a solid foundation in research and data work that I bring to the library world and other cultural organizations that WiLS partners with. So I've been working in the Wisconsin library landscape now for over 4 years, which is a little bit crazy to me to think about. And I feel really fortunate to get to do the work that I do in partnership with libraries and other cultural organizations across the state. Um,
Sorry.
oop, it seems like maybe is someone trying to ask a question?
No, I didn't realize I wasn't muted.
Oh,
Apologies.
okay. Oh, you're fine. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk data with y'all. I'm going to run through a quick roadmap of the topics that we're going to be covering today before we jump into the session. And after I do a little bit of talking, I'm actually going to be kind of workshopping some things out with you all. So if you have questions or clarifications as we move through the presentation, feel free to utilize the chat function. My colleague Andy is here and she will be watching chat. And I told her already to feel free to interrupt me since I won't be able to easily see if questions are coming in that kind of need to be answered in real time. So to situate our time together, we're going to be focusing today on using an existing data source to construct a data story by using the example of playing around with public libraries' annual report data from Wisconsin. This is a great example of a very large data set, many years of data that have been collected with a lot of meaningful and useful data in it that might feel a little unwieldy to interface with, hence the emphasis today on decoding data. How do we make sense of something like this that can be really large and kind of be at a loss where to really begin to look at things? For anyone who is not familiar, the annual report is how public library data is gathered consistently across the state and reported back to the Institute for Museum and Library Services, the IMLS. This occurs on an annual basis. So starting in September of this year, all public library staff in Wisconsin are going to have barrier-free access to a statewide data dashboard of this data for a pilot period that's going to be running from September 3rd through December 31st. This is thanks to the work of the Wisconsin Public Library Consortium that has been looking for different tech-related options to help Wisconsin library staff out. Since everyone is going to have ready access to this tool soon, which will be available, as I mentioned, until December, I wanted to build this session around ways to use tools like this dashboard or any other dashboard to tell an organizational story and to help with kind of decoding what might be going on in a large data set. So we're going to spend time today touching really briefly on existing data sources libraries and other cultural organizations might use to find data pertinent to their work in the communities that they work in. We're going to provide a brief introduction to the annual report for anyone who might not be familiar with that data set and a preview of the dashboard that will be coming. And then we're going to walk through a discussion and example of how to use benchmarking and peer comparisons in a tool like this dashboard as ways to find strategies for interpreting data and crafting a story. So existing data sources refer to any source of data that you don't have to collect yourself because it already exists. This includes everything from large-scale federal data sets like those produced by the US Census down to things like the results of previous surveys that your organization might have conducted. Existing data is a really great resource for storytelling at your organization, but it can also be really challenging to understand how to weed through large amounts of information to find what it is you might be looking for. In fact, that's probably one of the bigger barriers that a lot of people face isn't a lack of data, it's a lack of knowledge about all of the different data components that might already exist out there related to a topic. It can be very overwhelming. So while existing data sources can save you time and energy when it comes to collecting your own data, you don't have to go through that whole process. It also requires a certain amount of time and organization to be able to keep track of what sources of data might already exist and what data items are included in them, so that there's an understanding of where to go to look for information that you might need. So at WiLS, I partner with organizations around a lot of different research and data needs. And in my work as a data analyst, one thing that I often encourage folks to do is to create a sort of repository of existing data sources as a reference guide. That way, anytime there's a need for data to answer a question, you have a place first to go at this repository of information to see if data might already exist that you might need without the need to like go hunting, pecking, Googling, looking around every time you have a question that you might need to answer. So while that isn't the focus of this session, I did want to cover it briefly and also provide some inspirations for folks who might not be from the public library world for additional places to look for existing data that could be meaningful for their organizations there. So there's lots of resources that exist that can be helpful for any organization, a library, a cultural organization, a museum, a school, all of the above, to learn about their communities and themselves as organizations. So one of the first places that I encourage people to look at is that community level data by going to places like the census website, which does involve now some data visualization tools and dashboarding functionality. At the census.gov website, they have a data tool there, as well as other federal and state governmental sources of data. This is because the government tends to have better resources for gathering large scale data than a lot of other organizations might have. And so they're able to do things on a scale that most individual organizations would struggle to do. But demographic information, workforce development information, health and human services information, school district data, all of those things can construct a story for you about what might be going on in that broader community and can help situate organizational information that you might find as well. I love to pair that with other data sources when I'm working on a project and trying to craft a narrative there. In addition, for other library types like academic libraries and school libraries, while the annual report may not be as applicable to those library types, things like IPEDS data that is being gathered with library information as well as other institutional information that relates to the work of academic and school libraries in those contexts can be really helpful sources of institutional information that can be paired with other data sources as well. So taking that time to identify different resources and repositories of data is really valuable when thinking about utilizing data for storytelling by building a reference guide for yourself as a starting point to help guide that process. So with that in mind, I'm going to talk really briefly about what the annual report is for anyone who's not familiar. So today we'll be using public library service data as gathered in the Wisconsin's annual report for our example of how to interact with this kind of large scale data set and hopefully provide some insights into how to decode a large amount of data, some of which is more or less pertinent to any given use scenario. Before we dig into that, the Institute for Museum and Library Services conducts a full census annual survey of all U.S. public libraries called Public Library Survey. And in order to gather this information, each state is responsible for collecting their public library data and then sending it on to the IMLS. So in Wisconsin, that data process occurs via the annual report, which has typically opened in the state in January each year. This data then goes through a whole processing experience and is then published on the website for the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction in a spreadsheet format currently. You can also access another version of this data for the entire country on the IMLS website, where they also publicly publish the data sets in a spreadsheet format. Working in spreadsheets of data has its own challenges, so I'm going to choose to focus on a resource today that offers some level of analysis and visualization for ease of playing around with and familiarizing ourselves with the data itself. As mentioned, from September to December of this year, there will be a data dashboard pilot across the state of Wisconsin that will provide access to the dashboard that I'm going to have a little sneak peek preview of today with you all here. I am partnering with the WPLC on that project. So I did want to use this as an opportunity to share a little sneak peek of this tool and how it could be used because I'm really excited. And I want people to see the different ways that a tool like this can be harnessed to hopefully make people's lives a little bit easier. So with that in mind, I'm going to touch on a couple strategies for storytelling with data before we jump into kind of this case use scenario that I'm going to walk you all through. I would, as I just mentioned, be remiss not to emphasize and acknowledge the fact that sometimes using an existing data source requires some level of skill with data analysis and statistical modeling. Not all existing data sources are going to be in a visualized format or a format that provides some level of statistical information or modeling already. So with that said, tools that do some of this legwork for you can be really helpful. It's why I think a lot of people are attracted to the trend of data dashboards. It's like, I don't know what to do with this data. Let's put it in a dashboard. But there can still be a lack of confidence about how to use a large amount of data in really specific and strategic ways, even once it's been put into something like a dashboard. So that's going to be the focus of today. No real math whiz skills needed for anyone who might be nervous about numbers and be like, I don't remember my statistics class. None of that will be needed for interfacing with the dashboard or looking at and understanding what we'll be examining today. Storytelling with data can kind of take an inductive or deductive approach. So this means you might have a specific need, like advocating for a building expansion or trying to rethink your programming approach. And that might send you on a subsequent hunt for specific data to fill in that specific need. Or you might have a general interest in seeing a data set and what, when considered holistically, is rising to the top of that data set. So that process is one you might take when thinking really broadly about your organization for something like a strategic planning process where you kind of want to have your fingers in a lot of different data points to kind of get at what really is going on here on a larger scale there. So we're going to focus on the latter today because that process is also a really great way to familiarize ourselves with a large set of data. And that then can allow our imaginations to run a little bit wild in thinking about different use case scenarios that could come from it. So looking at something like this dashboard of public library data holistically first can point out to us trends that might not be obvious when we are not looking at how all of the data is moving in tandem and how it's all correlated and related to one another there. This exercise can also really complement developing an existing data source repository, like I mentioned a moment ago, by allowing you to become familiar with the different data points that are included in it and perhaps documenting some inspirations for future use. So just for a personal example, anytime I get into a new data set that I think I might want to use professionally at work, I'll add it to my list of places that I use for looking for data for different items. And I'll spend time going through and I'll take just little notes so I remember, hey, these data points are included in this data set. When I was looking at it, I saw some interesting things with XYZ. Later on, if we're thinking about, how to do this or how to do that, we might want to come back around to it. So just giving myself a place that when somebody comes to me with a question or I'm working on a project that needs data, I have a starting point where I can be like, okay, I could look at this, and I know it has these data points in it and I'm going to jump into it. So that more deductive approach can allow you the opportunity to really familiarize yourself with your organization and how it's kind of situated in a broader context. So I'm going to hop over to the dashboard now, and I'm going to do a really quick sneak peek so you can see the layout and format. But after I do that, I have built a single page that I'm going to do this case use example that I'm going to walk y'all through, because I don't want you to watch me hunting and pecking through 15 different pages in the dashboard. So we'll do it in a single place, so it's a little bit easier to look at there. So as I mentioned, this part will feel a little bit workshop-y. So I apologize in advance that if you're watching, sometimes it cannot be the most exciting thing to watch someone do something like a data dashboard analysis thing there. But I do want you all to see how a seemingly kind of messy data exploration can also produce really meaningful data points and stories to consider, and to show you kind of what that process looks like when I'm describing it, instead of it being like a hypothetical thing that I'm describing. So I'm going to switch over now to the data dashboard, and I am going to move into view mode, and I'm going to make this easier to see. So I'm going to adjust my screen size really quickly for you all. Make it a little bit bigger. Okay. So when we're in the dashboard itself for the release, the way that the dashboard is built is using a platform called Looker Studio. I love Looker Studio because it's a Google product that's free. So there isn't the licensing things that a lot of other softwares require. And it is pretty sophisticated in spite of being a free and open source tool. The dashboard itself, for the pilot, will have a lot of informational pages on the front end. I won't walk through all of those there, but they'll show folks how to navigate the dashboard. It will provide tutorials. And then there is a lot of data included. So when we look at the navigation menu, there's data visualizations on community and cardholder data, library square footage size, annual hours, staffing, library visits, circulation data, physical collection composition, e-content use, PC and Wi-Fi uses, programming, financials, things of that nature. And so each page of the dashboard offers different types of visualizations, and also will allow folks to filter down to see their own individual library in relation to other libraries. They'll be able to look at specific years of data. The dashboard pilot will include annual report data that goes from 2015 up to 2023, which is still preliminary data. And it also includes some strategies for benchmarking, utilizing something that we're referring to as cohort averages. So I'm going to explain those really quickly because I'm going to use those in the case use example. So essentially, to help facilitate benchmarking and identifying meaningful peer comparisons in the annual report data, the dashboard has two different metrics that we provide cohort averages for. Locale code, which is a designation that is assigned by the government, that indicates the kind of geographic location that an organization like a public library or school exists in. And it rates it with things like everything from like being rural fringe up to a big city. So it kind of designates it as a city, a suburban area, a township, or a rural area, and different designations there. The dashboard also includes cohorts based on population size bands of the resident population that's being served. These are two of a few different metrics that in statistical modeling of the entire data set are meaningful for doing comparisons. They're not perfect. Libraries are going to have places where there are outliers on them, but the idea of a cohort average is it takes all the libraries that share that characteristic and it creates a single average for them so folks can kind of see the trend, look at comparisons, and use it for understanding like, hey, what's going on with libraries that are in geographic communities like ours, serving a population size that's similar. And so we'll also help point folks to specific peer libraries there. So each page of the dashboard during the pilot will have different pieces of information that people will be able to look at and be able to filter accordingly, and kind of play around with the data there. So I'm going to take that concept and go to this playground page that I developed for us to kind of walk through an example of how to use a cohort comparison, how to look holistically at a dashboard to start to kind of pull different pieces of information out and try to kind of interpret what might be going on there. So let me get over to the playground page here and scroll so that that is centered. Okay, so let me give a little background information of what you are looking at here in this chart and what I'm going to be doing as we walk through it. So I picked two random libraries. So these are real libraries, but I renamed them Sample Library A and Sample Library B to protect the innocent. They both really do share the same locale code, which is they are large suburban areas. And so I am pairing those two libraries that have two very different stories, even though they're pretty similar in population size and are serving similar geographic communities, and benchmarking them against that locale average for large suburban areas. And I encourage folks to begin by looking at resident population size because it can be really helpful to understand, okay, is this community a lot bigger, a little bit bigger, to kind of situate findings from there. So library A is the blue line, library B is the gray line, and then the locale average is the orange line. And that will stay consistent as I go through and kind of play with this data and show you how we might want to look at all of these different metrics in tandem to start to get at a story that wouldn't be obvious if we were just looking at a single data point in isolation. So looking at Library A, we can see that both Library A and Library B, their resident population sizes are larger than the cohort average. So for Library B, it's just a little bit more, just by a few hundred. Library A is, a good 4,000, 5,000 community members larger. We can see too that there's different trends that are happening over time. So when I look here at this locale average, we can see that there's dips and changes, which is normal. Libraries, locale codes changes, things happen, places develop, et cetera, et cetera. But we can see that there's been a pretty slow increase over time. So in 2015, the average was at 19,400-ish, and it's up to 19,000, almost 800-ish. So it's grown a little bit. There's a slight population incline. We can see that for Library A, their community is growing really fast. Something's going on there. Library B, we see kind of a slow, very slight decline. So that's something that makes them unique in comparison to this locale average here, and is something to keep in mind. So most libraries who are in this geographic area with this population size are experiencing some type of population growth. And we now know that Library B is having a little bit of an outlier effect there, in that they're not growing, they're actually declining a little bit. So I'm going to look now to complement that at registered borrowers. So I'm going to switch this variable. And like I said, sorry in advance, you're going to watch me find the variables and change these charts. So remember that both libraries are larger resident population sizes than the cohort. From a logical, like if everything was perfect and there were no other variables impacting it, we would make an assumption then that both those libraries would have slightly more registered cardholders if everything was perfectly the same for everybody. And when we look at this now, this data now is showing us the total number of registered borrowers, which is the variable in the annual report. And we can see that that is true for Sample Library A. They do have a higher volume of registered cardholders than the cohort average. And that makes sense since they had a significantly larger population size. That said, when we look at Library B, something different is going on here. We can see that their total volume of registered cardholders is significantly, like 4,000 fewer than the cohort average, even though their population size is a little bit larger there. And so that raises some questions for me when I look at that. I'm like, I wonder what's going on there. We can see that everybody's kind of on a downward trend, but folks were much more in line with each other in 2016. We can see that the disparity has grown, especially for Library B. This is where I encourage you all to think about things through your own institutional subject matter expertise, personal knowledge. Data for storytelling is about having a story that you probably already know about in your community and in your library, and crafting that story by building data points into that there. So data for storytelling is about taking data and contextualizing it so that any audience, regardless of their technical expertise, their statistical abilities, et cetera, understand that there's this whole story, and it feels pretty compelling because you have this data in it that really validates what's going on. Conversely, this data, I can only make guesses at the differences. It would require people's personal subject matter knowledge to really be like, oh, do you want to know what happened in 2016? XYZ. And so then we have that story to go along with the data to really start to explain what might be going on there. It can make it easier to decipher the differences to make things a little more apples to apples. And the dashboard does do some calculations like that for folks. So I'm going to show you all here one of those metrics, and that is the percent of the resident population that has a library card. And this helps really make it clear that there is a very clear difference there. So this metric simply takes the resident population size and the resident registered borrowers and creates a percentage. So what percentage of your resident population is a card holder? And we can see here that for Library A, which had that much larger volume of card holders, that percentage is pretty in line with the cohort. It's 39 and 38% respectively. So that is not a really statistically significant difference. I would assume if I was running, statistically significant tests to validate that. We can see that for Library B, it's at 23.5%. That is much, much lower. So that validates that in spite of differences in the population size, they definitely have a much larger percentage, a much lower percentage of their population that has a library card. What's really interesting about this chart is going back to that 2016, look how identical everybody was then. So something has definitely happened for at least these libraries. If not, we'd have to do a little more work to see if this was a trend for other locales, but we can see there's been a pretty big kind of branching out over time with Library A slowly coming back more in line with the cohort itself. So looking at this to further situate any service differences. So before we start looking at circulation data, programming data, library visits, there's other library resources that could really impact how people are able to carry out those services that we might want to be familiar with before we get too much further down the road. So I'm going to pause here and brainstorm a little bit. And I would be curious myself to look at the library size, the square footage of the library, so the facility itself, staffing, and total income to give me a little bit more contextualization for what we might look at with library services there. So jumping to total income. Total income. Let's see what is going on there. Okay. So Library A and the cohort average, very in line with each other and have been along the way. So Library A has had a little bit more income than the cohort, but not anything too dramatically different. And we can see that they both have been on an upward trend where in 2015, the total income was 1.1 million. And in 2023, it's being reported at 1.3 million. Library B has something else going on there. So they have been below average, and that difference has only continued to grow. And like their population that was declining a little bit, we can see here that their income also appears to be declining as well. This is a significant difference in income, $500,000. And this is for populations that are very similar in size. So we can make some assumptions there that this limited income might potentially be having impacts on some of the other variables that we might be looking at as well. We're going to jump now to look at staffing because I'm like, okay, well, if we see that there, what's going on with total staff? So we'll switch over there to total staff and we can see if it will load. Okay, here we go. Once again, Library A, very in line with the cohort. We can see that their staffing numbers have been a little bit different, but generally followed a same trend and are very, very close to each other. Probably expectedly at this point, after looking at some of the other data, we can see here that Library B has a much lower total FTE volume, and that it has been decreasing over time at a higher rate than it appears it has for the cohort or the other library that we're benchmarking and playing around with there. I would expect that this is also going to have impact on services as well. If you have, it looks like about 5 or 6 fewer staff members than peer libraries that are serving a similar population size, and you're working with a budget that is $500,000 less than what the cohort and another sample library is working with in order to carry out their services. And let's look really briefly at the square footage of the library. Okay, so interestingly, Library B is the largest library currently. So the one that has the lower budget, lower staffing, has a physical space that is larger than the cohort or Library A. Square footage doesn't tend to change unless there's a renovation or an expansion or something like that. Or sometimes there are changes in how certain items are reported in the annual report. So I don't know the history of what was going on at Sample Library A that led to their square footage change. But that's where that institutional knowledge piece can be really beneficial as well. But I would imagine it was either a renovation, which seems a little odd if it led to a reduction in space, but could be possible. Seems more likely that maybe they had a branch that closed or something of that nature that might be contributing to that difference there. So looking at these numbers here, the Library A that's outperforming on some of those other metrics is in a smaller physical space than the cohort average and Library B. So for Library B, we know that space is not the limitation for them. So let me see. To make this even a little more apples to apples again, we can look at square feet per resident to really kind of highlight apples to apples information there. And we can see here that the Library B is pretty in line with the cohort average when it comes to that. And that Library A might be dealing with some space issues. So here's a story that's arising for Library A. We have population size that's larger than the cohort. We have funding that's in line. We have staffing that's in line. But look here, when we're looking at this space here, we have much less space based on these comparisons when we're looking at libraries that are serving similar communities and, similar sized populations there. There's a lot more we could look at, but for the sake of our time together, let's look at some library services, and we'll keep kind of building on this idea of crafting a story and kind of contextualizing things by looking at library services. So I'm going to jump to the bread and butter of what I know a lot of public libraries are navigating, which is total circulation data. So I'm going to pull that up now. And so as a reminder, we remember that Library B has that lower total income that could be pretty impactful, as well as that lower staffing when it comes to their facility, though, is very similarly sized to the cohort in Library A. Because of that, it's logical that their total circ would be lower. And when we look at their data, that's exactly what is going on there. So the average in 2023 for the cohort is right around 235K for total circ. And we can see that it's 265 for library A. They've been outperforming. That makes sense. And when it comes to library B, this is a logical difference when we're setting it up in that context that we started building by looking at the community first, the resources of the library first, and then looking at the library services component and thinking about how those might be correlated to one another there. What's also good to know about these graphs is that sometimes you can ignore the numbers and just look at the trend, because the trend information can be helpful as well. We know with that population trend that there was some differences. Two of the items were increasing when it came to resident population, one was decreasing. When we look at total circulation, these look pretty similar to each other. And that can be a helpful thing to know. Everybody had a dip when it came to COVID. Everybody's coming back up, but they're not to their pre-COVID levels. And so we can see that just by eyeballing the charts, there's very similar trends that are happening there. And there isn't anything wonky happening to any individual library when it comes to increasing or decreasing their total circulation numbers there. Another item that we can look at is library visits, and that can be interesting to think about in relation to circulation, and we'll look at programming numbers in a minute. Looking at the library visits data, once again, we would assume that if the trend continues, library A would be outperforming the cohort, and library B would be underperforming when it comes to the cohort. And we can see that there's been some interesting shifts here. So library A has been really strong. Their circulation was higher, their budget's a little bit higher. Their facility is smaller though, since I think that change we saw in there was in 2019 to 2020. And if that really is a true change, we can see how it's impacted visits, right? They were above the cohort until there was that square footage change. And we can see here that now the cohort has begun to outpace them when it comes to the number of library visits. In expected news, library B here has followed a somewhat similar trend, but is definitely below the cohort average significantly. And that would line up with the lower volume of cardholders, the lower volume of staff. We didn't look at annual hours, but that's another one where we might be able to piece together kind of a holistic story of factors that might be contributing to that there. So let's see how all this translates to something like total program attendance. So we'll pull up total program attendance. And we can see here that while we know library A and B are differently resourced, it's very interesting to see that in 2022, both libraries had essentially identical total program attendance, which is also very in line with the cohort. So the cohort has converged again on this data point, which hasn't happened in a while when we've been looking at these charts here. And so we can see some different trends that folks have been on here, the COVID dip, the recovery, things of that nature there. Library B went back down a little bit in 2023 when it came to their program attendance. So I'd be curious about what is going on there and some of the factors that could be contributing to that. But let's do an apples to comparison. The dashboard allows us to see the average number of attendees that are coming to programs that are offered. And we can see here that this is an area of strength actually for library B. So library B is our one that has the much lower budget. It's the one that has less staff. It's serving a community that is larger than the cohorts. Their library facility is appropriately sized, but when we're looking at programming, this is an area where we're seeing strength in the volume of folks who are coming to their programs, the number of attendees that are coming. So in 2023, we can see that they're doing better than the average there. They did better in 2022. And that this is an area where if we had just looked at this data point in isolation, it wouldn't be as strong of a data point because we didn't situate it in all of those other factors that we just considered when we're looking at the data more holistically and in tandem and seeing those correlations there. So I'm going to stop making you stare at me doing my favorite thing, which is playing with data and to like tie a bow on the case you study and to kind of close the loop on the theme of this session. The goal behind using something like this tool is to make your job easier, but it's only going to be easier if folks have some basic familiarity with what information is being gathered in that data set and how those items are related to one another. And the challenge of something like a dashboard is that people often will think, oh, I can just hop on and look at this one data point and it's going to give me all the information that I need. And unfortunately, it can be a little bit more nuanced than that. And taking the time to understand kind of holistically the story of even just your library, like where are we at? How are these trends similar or different? How might they be related to one another is a meaningful practice. And benchmarking can provide even more illumination to some of the differences that might be going on there and how to make sense of areas of strength or challenge that might not be obvious if we just looked at a data point in isolation. So that's my spiel. I held time at the end for folks to be able to ask questions, clarifications. I didn't hear Andy interrupt me, so hopefully there weren't any pressing questions that came up, but I wanted to hold time for folks to ask questions since I know this is a little bit of a heady topic. Good chat too. Okay. Okay. Oh, I'm seeing, Andy, that my internet was laggy. I apologize. I didn't realize that was happening. Hopefully it wasn't too distracting. Yes, Joe, I'm excited. Great. So Stephanie, the website that will have the dashboard, it's going to be hosted on the WPLC, the Wisconsin Public Library Consortium website. So information will be disseminated through public library systems, probably late August, early September. And the dashboard will be available beginning on September 3rd on the WPLC website. And it's going to be on an unlisted page that people will just need the direct link to go to, but there won't be any login credentials or anything that'll be required. It'll just be ready for action and look very similar to what you just saw in the little sneak peek preview. Awesome. Thank you, Tina. I'm excited and I hope that it proves to be useful and helpful to folks. Well, if no one else has any questions, that concludes our time together. I really appreciate y'all being here. This session is being recorded, so you'll receive a recording after the fact. So if you want to relook at the case study example or anything like that, that'll be available in there. And I appreciate your patience with my internet and also watching me be a nerd about something that I'm really passionate about. So I hope y'all have a wonderful Friday. Thank you so much for joining us for WiLSWorld Shorts. Andy is dropping my contact information in the chat, so feel free to email me if you have any thoughts, questions, inspirations, or just want to talk nerdy about data stuff, which is something I enjoy doing too. Thank you.